Дамы и господа, президент Российской Федерации Владимир Владимирович Путин.
A Kremlin-sponsored disinformation campaign claims that a new deadly virus is actually a biological weapon developed in a secret U.S. laboratory. Is it 1983 or is it 2020? Well, actually, it's both. Because when it comes to Russian active measures, the more things change, the more they stay the same. From the HIV/AIDS crisis to the anti-vaxxer movement to the COVID-19 crisis, false narratives about public health issues have long been a key vector of Russian disinformation and malign influence operations. So what do Kremlin campaigns in the past teach us about what we are facing today? Hello from my makeshift studio in my Adams Morgan home in Washington, D.C., and welcome to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, Director of the Russia Program at Sipher. And joining me this week is the single best person I could think of to talk about this issue. John Sipher is a 28-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency's National Clandestine Service, and at the peak of his career served as a member of the CIA's Senior Intelligence Service, the leadership team that guides the agency's activities globally. He's the recipient of the Distinguished Career Intelligence Medal and also probably has the coolest name an intelligence officer ever had. Welcome to back to the podcast, John. It's great to see you again.
Thanks. Glad to be here. Appreciate it.
Glad to have you. And also with us from his home in Alexandria, Virginia, where they tell me there's an awesome old town, is former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome back, Don.
Well, with a much more boring last name, but thank you, guys. Good to see you again.
Hey, Jensen's a fine last name. It's just not nearly as cool as Sipher.
Hey, Greg, not close.
Back in 1983, a pro-Soviet newspaper in India called Patriot published an anonymous letter purportedly from a well-known American scientist claiming that HIV/AIDS had been developed in a secret biological weapons laboratory in Fort Detrick, a U.S. Army medical compound installation in Frederick, Maryland. In 1985, a purported retired biophysicist, Dr. Jacob Segal, claimed that the AIDS virus was synthesized by combining parts of other retroviruses via VISNA and HTLV1. Soviet fronts across the world began reporting on this. And Segal was actually an East German Stasi operative posing as a French doctor. By 1987, this story had received coverage in over 80 countries in 30 languages, and unfortunately, some people continue to believe it to this day. John, take us back in time, if you will, to the 1980s, to a time when we were all younger and when I actually had hair. What lessons were learned from that operation, which was called Operation Infection in Russian and Operation Denver? The Stasi operation, from what I understand. What did we learn from those operations, and how do they apply to Russian disinformation on COVID-19, which appears on the surface to be remarkably similar?
I'm not sure we learned a lot, but we certainly can learn a lot from the history, because this was an operation that the Russians did very consistent with their pattern of behavior over the Cold War and then all the way up to 2016 and today. So let me try to put it in a little bit of a context. The operation to spread the message that the United States military created the AIDS virus was an operation that was like one of thousands trotted out during the Cold War by the Soviets. It started in India with this article that you mentioned, but it made its way into the Western media by being pushed by Russian intelligence officers. But it's part of a much larger effort at perception management that the Russians and the Soviets called active measures. Active measures is really like just a term of art that's distinct from classic espionage, analysis, or counterintelligence. Instead, it's an active way of subversion. It's political warfare. It's sort of using your security services to push disinformation and a variety of other subversive activities. So we often focus on disinformation, but it also includes funding of violent groups, media manipulation, propaganda, forgeries, agents of influence, political violence, sabotage, even assassination. It's all part of this active effort that the Soviets and now the Russians do. And from the earliest days of the Bolshevik Revolution, it was a means that they used both domestically and internationally to weaken their enemies from within. It's asymmetric warfare, if you will. So let's fast forward a little bit to your question about today, what we saw in 2016 and what we're seeing today. For a variety of reasons, even though we saw this playing out during the Cold War, by 2016, we really failed to focus on Putin's continuing use of active measures. I mean, we were so focused on terrorism. We had this sort of naive belief that the Russians had changed. A variety of things sort of came together so that we weren't paying attention and we weren't ready in 2016. Also, social media and our hyper-partisan tribal politics allowed the Kremlin to weaponize and disrupt our elections. So we look at today, we're seeing that others are learning from this, right? The Chinese, the COVID crisis is perfectly put together to be used and manipulated by the Russians, Chinese, and others. But today, I think in many ways it's a more diffuse effort. Unlike the discrete operation to promote this AIDS story, the Russians and others now can essentially just pick and choose from narratives that are created already in the West and then just amplify those conspiracies. They can throw anything at the wall, see what sticks, and then use their mechanisms, propaganda and other media to overwhelm, lie, and seek to confuse. And so nowadays it's more of a machine gun approach versus maybe the sniper approach that created the false narrative of the AIDS virus. So to your question, then, what have we learned? I think, of course, now we're much more aware that the Russians are still doing these things. And now when we see the Chinese and others do it, we can put it into context. But we're still not very successful in battling it. And I think some of that now, sadly, is due to our political situation. President Trump has been able to turn the narrative so that we're not looking at this as a national security issue. Instead, we continue to look at this as a domestic political issue. So if the issue of Russian active measures or Chinese active measures is brought up now, there's an army of Trump supporters who immediately go on the offensive because they see it as an effort to attack the president. So until we can look at this as a national security issue rather than a domestic political issue, it's going to be really hard to battle it. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I would second that in a big way. It's one of the most frustrating things about this is that it is looked at in a partisan way. I like your kind of approach of the machine gun versus the sniper. And when I think back to the Soviet disinformation campaign surrounding HIV/AIDS, at the time I kind of looked at it in this is part of this ridiculous pantheon of Soviet disinformation that actually looks really clumsy or looked clumsy at the time. I mean, everything from that Lyndon Johnson was behind the JFK assassination. And God, I remember teaching a course at the University of South Carolina back in the 80s and had a student say, well, wasn't Johnson behind the JFK assassination? And I was like, no, that's a Soviet propaganda campaign. But anyway, but you had that, you had the moon landing was staged. And oh, by the way, the Pentagon developed AIDS. Was true damage done by these disinformation campaigns? Because I think we laymen had kind of a tendency to dismiss them as just kind of ridiculous Soviet things that can be kind of parodied on Saturday Night Live practically. But in reality, some real damage was done, was it not?
I think that's true. I mean, their goal was always to weaken us, and not just in our own country, but also in areas what they used to call through the third world and other places. So, Russian intelligence officers, Soviet intelligence officers during the Cold War, I think it was Oleg Kalugin, the most senior Russian person ever to become a general, said that 80% of Soviet intelligence work was these active measures, more than it was espionage and collecting intelligence and these things. So he, for example, describes when he worked in New York, they would go out and they would paint swastikas on Jewish cemeteries, and they would ransack synagogues, and they would send racist letters to African ambassadors in New York and in Washington. They would spread these stories that in Latin America that the military was harvesting baby parts and all these kind of things. And a lot of it probably was silly. There was forgeries, and they would spread things that the CIA and others had done these assassinations through parts of the third world. But like you said, a lot of it caught on. I can think of some real damage that was done. For example, the AIDS story that we talked about. I remember in Zimbabwe, when the AIDS crisis was terrible and death was, people were dying at a terrible rate in Zimbabwe. Finally, the Zimbabwe Vice President Joshua Nkomo gave a public speech and commented that his own son had died of AIDS. And a lot of people thought that was perhaps would be a turning point, that the World Health Organization and others were trying to put scientists in to help, make sure they had clean needles and did proper sex and these things in those places. But with his next breath, Nkomo spoke to the country and said, but we all know that the AIDS crisis is created by the US military. Therefore, there's nothing you can do. And these scientists who are telling you that there's ways to stop this, it's just part of a propaganda campaign from the West. So you can think of the thousands of people who died because these leaders actually believed this story. And there's other ones like that. For example, in Mecca, when it was taken over by sort of an Al-Qaeda group in 1979, the Russians spread a story throughout the Islamic world that U.S. Marines were in Mecca, and in places like Pakistan, they stormed the embassy and burned it down, killed a number of Americans and things. So did it have strategic value? I think it did in a number of countries, but it's a long-term effort by the Russians to sort of weaken us from within, and so they continue it because they think it's valuable. Whether it's valuable enough to do serious damage, we'll have to see.
Don, you were in state at the time. I mean, you remember this. I'd like to kind of get your thoughts on how this whole disinfo campaign around AIDS came out and the effect that it had and the lessons we can learn from it today.
Yeah. First of all, I want to I thank both of you for raising a number of very important issues, which I want to reemphasize in a second. I was, I think, underappreciative of the effect it might have that John just described. I thought basically, who would believe this nonsense? And clearly a lot of people did, whether it's in Africa or other places. But I'm very appreciative of both of you bringing back up the issue of the continuity with Soviet practice, because there are strong continuities. But I think John mentioned some differences too, which I think are worth bearing out. Number one, the technology, social media, I think you said it, Brian, is something that makes this stuff potentially, I think, a lot more effective and a lot more of a shotgun rather than a sniper. You can hit a lot of targets at once. The globalization phenomenon means that I think a lot of countries pay more attention to all of this stuff. So again, I think the potential for mischief is greater. But Brian, I think you said it, maybe John did, that the issue of our own vulnerability is higher, and you have people in this country who believe this nonsense. And thus the political debate becomes not a Reagan versus USSR debate about truth versus non-truth. It becomes a war of competing narratives. We don't trust either side. And people in downtown Alexandria will give you a Russian narrative that's simply not true. I spoke to some students the day before yesterday and had someone ask a question in class, guys, similar to what you talked about, Brian. So I think we are more vulnerable, and we have made ourselves more vulnerable to this kind of thing. And that's a great, great difference from what happened in the 1980s.
Yeah, if you compare I haven't seen any polls on this, but I'd just be interested to see, and I would certainly have a hypothesis about this, the amount of Americans, the level of Americans who actually believe the HIV disinfo compared to the amount of the level of anti-vaxxers in our country today, which is also a narrative that has been pushed relentlessly by Russia. I think it would speak to how much more polarized we are right now.
Brian, absolutely. Or you talk about outside agitators and how to view various activist groups. It's all over the place, and it's disheartening and irritating and unfortunate.
I mean, one thing I wanted to get kind of both of you to speak to is, and I think, John, you alluded to it, that we were kind of slow to catch on to what the Soviets were doing, and we're slow to catch on now to what the Russians are doing. I mean, you mentioned that these active measures have been going on almost, since the Bolshevik Revolution. I mean, was the agency and was the State Department slow to catch on to this initially? I mean, I'm talking back in the Soviet period in the Cold War. I mean, I know we had the active measures working group in the Reagan administration, which appeared to me to be the first kind of concerted government effort to actively push back on active measures. But I wonder if you could both kind of speak to the quickness or lack thereof of USG's response to this.
Yeah, the active measures group in State Department, which sort of coordinated amongst a number of agencies, was sort of the first effort to push back. And it did get into, I think, President Reagan and Secretary of State Schultz actually pushed back against Gorbachev. And Gorbachev, towards the end, actually publicly stated that the AIDS effort was an active measures, and it was wrong. It was wrong. So there was some success there. But I don't think the U.S. government ever really took it that seriously. I think the Russians, had a longer term view. We tend to focus on sort of what is today's crisis, and I think they had a longer term view and thought that this kind of thing would work in a lot part of the world where they were competing with us. And so I think the thing to remember, there's a couple things here. The goal for them is this is like a virus itself. The goal is to impact perceptions and emotions, and it's not so much to change the view on a specific fact. It's more to overwhelm you with so much crap and confuse you so that it's harder to tell truth from fiction. So, we argue over facts, and so we can't focus on solutions. And so I think, they truly believe that this can change the way our leadership is believed and trusted. And so, the only time we really see this succeeding is now. I mean, I think we have our own president who sort of buys conspiracy theories, which then, of course, is a signal to a lot of other people that some of this stuff may be real, or it's impossible to know what's real. And in that case, the Russians win. If we're sitting there fighting over what should be obvious facts, it makes us much harder to come together and have sort of a consistent foreign policy to deal with these issues.
So reviving the active measures working group in today's context, would that be a necessary but not sufficient step, really?
Well, the problem is, we saw with terrorism, we all said, you need a whole of government approach if you're going to deal with this worldwide phenomenon or this big threat to our country. The problem is you certainly have people in the U.S. government that understand this and probably would want us to do some version of a 9/11 commission or a active measures working group or something. But you have a president who has just the opposite view, who sees this as a domestic political tool that he can weaponize for his benefit. So as long as you have different parts of the government moving in different directions, it's going to be really hard to solve that problem.
Right. Don, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, very interesting. I wanted to make 2 points about this. Number one, we did push back, gentlemen. We pushed back with things like RFE, where Brian and I worked for a long time, which in the 80s was really nothing other than an effort to push back on a lot of this stuff. And we would have armies of expats translating scripts and having factual and resource deep archives at their disposal. And the second point I would make is that as firm as all of us all three of us are on Russia's misbehavior, I think there's an argument to be made for cultural and social engagement of some sort. Because when you see the enemy as this black hole or a monster or always up to no good, I think that increases tension and makes the field much more fertile for fertilizing these kind of nonsense narratives. I won't use the C word, which John used. I'll say nonsense.
Another thing I was wondering about, and this is something I'm giving a lot of thought to right now, because I do want to write about it, is there something about public health issues that is particularly susceptible to Russian malign influence, disinformation, and active measures campaigns? Because you had HIV/AIDS, you had the very active Russian active measures regarding the anti-vaxxers, very effective, I might add, and now you have this going on with COVID. Is there something about public health in particular? John, I see you nodding, so I think you
Well, what we have to remember is for the most part, the Russians and others, they don't create these narratives out of the blue. They essentially take things that are already troublesome and then they amplify and exploit them. And there's few things that can cause public fear than these sort of health issues. And so identifying and exploiting public fears is essentially the bread and butter of active measures and disinformation, preying on emotions. And so when you're talking about public health and you can throw in these terms with these, like I think you wrote about some of these labs, and they can say that they're involved with bioweapons. For example, I worked for a while in Indonesia. In Indonesia, there's a naval lab called NAMRU, which was working on bird flu. And it got twisted around and they ended up kicking out. The Americans were doing incredibly good work there because they were spinning a narrative that they were using the bird flu to weaponize it for bioweapons. It was absolute nonsense. And they lost a lot of people working to actually help public health because they were able to twist and use public fears to stir up this kind of thing. And so I think public health and these kind of issues, especially things like COVID now, are perfectly set up for these kind of active measures and disinformation campaigns.
Now, would you agree? Do you see something very specific about public health here that is susceptible to Russian active measures?
It's quiet. I very much do, and I very much agree. It's quiet, plays on people's fears, conspiracy theories. There are issues like that or corruption, which I think are very hard to refute factually because you can't measure the spread very well, despite our statistics of what's going on in the public health crisis. I would also say that this is helpful for Moscow and Beijing in conjunction with a lot of other kinds of fragile state scenarios where ethnic strife or violence against women or extremism or terrorism wraps up into this kind of thing, and it makes a situation, as John said, already vulnerable. It makes it much worse.
Before we move into, John, I'm glad you brought up the issue of the labs in Georgia and Ukraine. I want to do a deep dive into that in the second half because I did write on this last week and I kind of find it really, really fascinating. But one other thing I did want to touch on, because it's another thing that kind of jumped out at me as I'm looking at this. If you look at the HIV campaign conducted by the Soviets, and the COVID-19 one being conducted by the Russian Federation right now, another common denominator is that Russia was helped along in these disinformation campaigns by allies and proxies, right? If you look back at the HIV/AIDS campaign, it started in a communist newspaper in India. It was picked up by a Stasi agent posing as a French physician, and the Stasi had a big role in this. Bulgarian intelligence had a big role in it. The Czechoslovak, the STB, the then Czechoslovak intelligence service had a big role in it. Today, you see it Russia being helped along by China in this, ironically, as well as to a degree, if I'm not mistaken, Iran. So how important are allies and proxies in this situation? And what could the U.S. do to deny the Kremlin access to these allies and proxies, to raise the costs for these allies and proxies in participating in disinfo campaigns on public health issues, which actually I think should be taken quite seriously?
Well, I would say certainly in this situation with COVID, it brings together the allies, China and Russia. And so part of the fact that we have blamed China for the virus, the Wuhan virus, if you will, is sort of our effort domestically, politically, to push and find scapegoats for somebody to blame. But usually with these kind of disinformation campaigns, as you know, that's part of one of the powerful things. Is finding scapegoats to blame, right? So if you look at the AIDS effort, one of the things that the allies, what they use in East Europe and Stasi and East Germany and others is they spread information through Africa. For example, the U.S. scientists who were looking at AIDS and saying that it had come from Africa, this was a U.S. racist effort to try to put down Africa, so that the Russians could then, push with the Africans to say this is the Americans, using this against you. And so now you fast forward this and you see both sides trying to blame others for COVID. It plays right into the ability to weaponize these kind of things. And so right now the Russians and Chinese have a interest in working together because they want to push the blame towards the United States. And it's actually a perfect time to do that.
I mean, an ironic thing about a lot of this, as I was reading into the history of the HIV campaign, and by the late 80s, by 87, I mean, this campaign started in 83. By 87, we're well into perestroika. Gorbachev realizes that the Soviet Union's got its very own AIDS problem, and that the best expertise in this area was where? Well, in the West and in the U.S. And he needed the U.S.'s help. And if I'm not mistaken, if I'm reading the history correctly, the U.S. said, we'll be glad to help once you stop this propaganda campaign saying that the Pentagon created this. So there was leverage that eventually the United States could use, even against this geopolitical adversary at the time. Never mind other proxies that are being used. So we are not helpless in this fight. Don, any thoughts from you before we jump into the next segment?
I absolutely agree. We're very passively reacting to this. If you could, the U.S. took the initiative in trying to combat the problem in some vulnerable states, I think politically it would be a great advantage to U.S. foreign policy. But now it's all politicized, it's spoiled, it's seen as part of great power competition. And for the reasons both of you mentioned, our motives are always questioned now. And that was not the case in the 1980s.
Yeah, no, it's remarkable. John, any last thoughts from you before we move into the second segment and kind of dive into these labs in the former Soviet space?
No.
Okay.
Let's do it.
Okay, on that note, we'll shift gears. In a few moments, we will continue our discussion and take a closer look at the long-standing Russian disinformation campaign against the U.S. Department of Defense's biological threat reduction program and how it has been repurposed for COVID-19. I'd like to remind you, you are listening to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, Director of the Russia Program at Sipher. Joining me is John Sipher, a 28-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency's National Clandestine Service. Also with us is former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. I'd also like to remind you could subscribe to the Power Vertical podcast on iTunes. You could read the Power Vertical blog and watch the vertical video at sipa.org. And you can follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. The Russian disinformation campaign backed by China claiming that COVID-19 was a U.S. manufactured biological weapon developed in the Tbilisi-based Richard Lugar Center for Public Health Research actually repurposed a long-standing Kremlin disinformation narrative. The Lugar Center is part of the U.S. Department of Defense's biological threat reduction programs, which help partner countries counter the threat of infectious disease outbreaks. But for years, Russian propaganda has been targeting laboratories in the former Soviet Union, most notably in Georgia and in Ukraine, incorrectly claiming that they are clandestine biological weapons labs. It's a through-the-looking-glass world where you are taking something that is designed to counter pandemics, help partner countries fight pandemics, and say these are actually things that cause pandemics. It's a textbook case in Russian propaganda. But John, this is also another common tactic at work here. It's you take an existing disinformation campaign. The Russians didn't know COVID was coming. But they had this existing disinfo campaign against all these labs that the U.S. had in the former Soviet Union, prominently in Georgia, where incidentally, the Lugar Center is in Georgian. This is not me saying, blowing America's horn there. It's Georgian officials have told me personally that Georgia's very effective response to COVID-19, I mean, to my last count, they only had 12 deaths, was largely thanks to the Lugar Center. There was this long-standing campaign against this, and now it's being repurposed. How common is this, where you take for the Russians to take something that's been existing for a long time, and they've been doing this for a long time now, but yet now you have this repurpose to say, see, it caused COVID. How common is that?
Well, I think it's common basically because it works. There's no reason to change things that work, and you can sort of weaponize and push these things. And so it fits perfectly into sort of consistent themes. So as you know, the Russians have, this is not just an anti-US tool. Georgia and Ukraine have been recipients of Russian pushback and clandestine and covert effort for years. And so I think the Russian intelligence collection mechanism around the world supports their effort to do these kind of disinformation and active measures campaigns. And so the Russians, I think, they understand us very well. They have diplomats here. They've been following US politics. And so it's very easy these days to pick up specific things that prey on emotions. That's why racism is always something they pushed on. That's why we talked about health threats and bioweapons and these nefarious sounding things that people don't quite understand. Those are the perfect kind of tools that you can amplify and exploit. And so, their efforts to push in Georgia and Ukraine and the United States on these issues are nothing new, and there's no reason for them to change it as long as it works. These kind of smears have an effect.
Right. Don, your thoughts?
I was going to say complain about or emphasize that the U.S. is held to a higher standard in a lot of these places. And so you see the Russians had till very recently, and perhaps still do, a CW program, a biological warfare program. They do research on a lot of these viruses, and it never comes up. All we see, Brian, as you said, was a disinformation campaign that at least some people believe. And the other point I wanted to make is that, yes, they do seem to know us better, our racial problems, the other vulnerabilities, faults of our society, better than we think they do. I always think of Russia's understanding of the U.S. as sort of heavy-handed and not understanding the role of Congress and so forth. But they do pay attention to social trends, and they're willing, as John said, to employ them with some effect. And perhaps we should, get more aware of that and try to build our defenses, because they clearly are manipulating it.
Yeah, I mean, as I watched the kind of the campaign unfold, I mean, the Lugar Center had been going on for a while, but then now they're picking up on these labs in Ukraine. And it looks like a very well coordinated campaign. I mean, first you had Viktor Medvedchuk, who is a member of the Ukrainian parliament, a pro-Russian member of the Ukrainian parliament, personally very close to Putin. Right? He sent an official letter to President Zelensky demanding to know what's going on in these super clandestine U.S. biological weapons laboratories that are dotting all around Ukraine. Now, I checked the U.S. Embassy website. There's always been this information on the website about this program. It's never been any big secret. But nevertheless, the effect was made. Who's looking at the U.S. Embassy website every day, as a matter of fact. So what happens is the U.S. Embassy is forced to respond, and they put out a statement, basically reiterating what's long been on their website with a link, right? But then the Ukrainian media, the pro-Russian media in Ukraine, and the Russian media come out and say, the U.S. has finally admitted to their secret biological weapons laboratories in Ukraine, which of course the U.S. had done nothing of the sort. Then, almost as if on cue, Rossiyskaya Gazeta, the official Russian government newspaper, comes in with a big story that the U.S. admits that it has biological weapons laboratories in Ukraine. Maria Zakharova, the spokesperson for the Russian foreign ministry, comes out with a statement expressing deep concern about this. Sergei Lavrov comes out. It goes all the way up to the level of the foreign minister. And then, so there's that one, the deep coordination of this it's hard to miss. The other thing that was hard to miss was the coordination between Russia and China on this, because Sputnik came out with a report saying that China should not allow international inspections or any international investigation of the Wuhan lab until the U.S. allows international inspections of its biological weapons laboratories in the former Soviet Union. And then the Global Times, China's basically their functional equivalent of Sputnik, comes out with a similar story along these lines. So this seems very, 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 very well coordinated. John, does it look familiar to you in terms of how this works, or have the Russians actually gotten better at this?
Well, the thing to remember, you have Vladimir Putin, president for 20 years, who's a KGB officer, who grew up with this Chekist mentality from the beginning, of the Bolshevik Revolution, that you have to be on the offensive, that you're always under threat. And there's historical reasons where the Russians have felt under threat and over the years. And so to them, the offense is the best defense, and they've sort of continued at this way of doing things and using their intelligence and security services as sort of their cutting edge of their foreign policy. It's that mentality, the Chekist mentality, if you will. And, frankly, throughout the Cold War and after, defector after defector or source after source has told us that there's an ongoing war against the West, and we're trying to damage you from the inside. It is political warfare. Now, this has been a strength for the Russians because they're good at it and it's pushed back, but also I think it's been a weakness for them, because I wonder to what extent do they start believing some of this stuff. If you work in this conspiratorial world of you're always under threat and people are always trying to undercut you, and the world's a threatening place and we have to be on the offense all the time. We've looked at over the years, they've been incredibly good at espionage and these active measures and sort of keeping people off balance to keep themselves in power, but they've been much, much worse at accurately analyzing what the West is trying to do, understanding the intelligence they've gotten. World War II is a great example. They were getting incredible information from the British and from Sorga in Japan and other places about what the Germans and things were up to, but their leadership had this conspiratorial mentality that they just couldn't believe the things they were being told. They didn't travel much. They were involved in their sort of constant internal battles between each other and politically, and so they were great at sort of the offense side, and they were not so great at understanding what it all meant. And so I sometimes worry that they're sort of so deep in this conspiratorial view of the world that they're starting to believe some of it, and it's going to hurt them internally. I think Don probably has a better sense of that than I do.
Yeah, John, I hate to be gloomier than you, if that's possible, but I think most of them do believe it. And I think if the Siloviki factions, plural, I think, if you read any Pathogens speech, which three of us have read a lot, I think he really believes that stuff. And second, there was a very interesting article at the beginning of the year on the curriculum for upcoming cadets in some of the power ministries, which very much teaches this stuff. You're surrounded by enemies. The U.S. is the enemy. Be on the offense. And I think that is part of the way they're socialized. So, John, as you said, Putin is a product of that system. I think he believes it. I think he believes it. And I think a lot of the others do too, Pathogens in particular.
This kind of just popped into my mind, but do you both think the Russians just kind of got lucky with this existing narrative about the Department of Defense's biological threat reduction program, and then along comes COVID? Or do you think, it seemed to me this was just one of these run-of-the-mill ridiculous Russian propaganda campaigns designed to discredit the U.S. in the former Soviet Union, most notably Ukraine and Georgia, the closest two former Soviet states to the West, excluding the Baltic states, of course. Or did they think, sooner or later there's going to be a pandemic that's going to come along, and then we're going to be able to use this existing narrative to blame the Americans? I'm not sure if there's an easy answer to that, but it just kind of came into my head as we were talking.
I think they react very quickly. I think Brian, how many times in this program we talked about their tactical adeptness and how quickly they respond. And I think John said earlier, it's the spaghetti approach. You follow an opportunity. If that doesn't work, you go in a different direction.
Here I was giving him more credit for being strategic than I usually do.
Well, I
because
think
this would be,
our
if the whole campaign, which started, like a decade ago, or a little less than a decade ago, 2011, I guess. If you could think of that they were thinking, all right, this will be a good kind of tactical maneuver to discredit the U.S. and the former Soviet Union. But sooner or later, a pandemic's going to come along, big or small. I mean, I don't know, it didn't have to be one as big and deadly as this one. It could have been something like, H1N1 or SARS.
and Ebola didn't work.
We're going to be able to blame the Americans for it.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering how strategic or tactical do you see them? Did they just get lucky here?
Well, I think I talked about how the all of government approach and one of the weaknesses of the United States is sort of playing from crisis to crisis and these kind of things. The one thing that I think Putin has going for him is their foreign policy is pretty consistent. It's screw the United States and separate Europe from the United States. Every institution, every informal actor, everybody who wants to please the Kremlin knows that if they can do something to mess with the United States, they're doing the right thing. And so one advantage that gives him is he could have hackers out there stealing information, and he can have espionage cases going on, and he can have the foreign ministry spinning stuff, and he can have these media companies spinning stuff. And then as things come in, he can sort of collect them and use them depending on what's happening. And so he can, since everyone's moving in the same direction, we could see that in 2016 as the election came along, everybody was sort of going to try to cause trouble in the United States. And so all of a sudden as the election came up, you're like, oh, look at this. We have some stuff from the DNC. Oh, look, we also have some stuff over here that they could then weaponize and push forward. The fact is, we in the United States, we're worried about what's happening in China. We're involved in the Middle East. We're worried about what's happening in Africa. We're global powers, commercially. We're involved in all these kind of things. Russia has a very sort of focused foreign policy, and therefore I think that gives them an advantage, and it makes it easier to jump on these things when they come up.
The irony of all of this, and it's almost a happy irony, if you can kind of use that adjective to describe anything that's happening right now, is that if there is one place in the world where the U.S. is getting good credit for on COVID, it's Georgia, because Georgians are really now quick to credit the Lugar Center with helping Georgia with its COVID response. I just participated in a virtual event with the Rondelli Foundation in Tbilisi a couple of weeks back, and that came through loud and clear. So all of the Russian propaganda against the Lugar Center, actually when this center was actually supposed to do what it was designed to do, and it's really retooled itself to do rapid testing with 24-hour turnover. I mean, God, what I wouldn't give for that right here in Washington right now. So Georgians are actually crediting the Lugar Center, and you have to wonder at the end of the day, is all that propaganda for naught, or has it done its damage? Any thoughts on that? John, Don, either?
Well, I was just going to say quickly that the countries, I mean, you guys know this, the countries around Russia have been dealing with this issue for decades and decades, are more sophisticated about this. So Baltic countries and Ukraine and Georgia and others, and some of those countries were part of the Soviet Union. You can make a case that America in 2016 wasn't paying attention because we had our eyes on all sorts of other balls. But these guys, they very quickly see when the Russians are up to propaganda, and they're probably a little bit better at pushing back against it.
Don, your thoughts?
I want to get to a point that John made, which is about this Russian view of Russian interaction with the world. I think they are tactical. They're also much less interested, or almost don't care, about consistency or contradictions between their approach, say, to Venezuela and their approach to some other place. That gives them a lot more flexibility as well. I think the U.S., passive bogged down as we might be on interagency meetings sometimes, we tend to have a more of an overarching strategic concept. Whether it's put in place effectively, it's another program. But the Russians just throw it out there, they see what happens, they move on, and messing with the U.S. or causing chaos creation, John, is, I think, in the tactical level, what they want. And thus, it's in some ways much easier to carry out in kind of a full-blown, thoughtfully, carefully articulated policy of the kind the U.S. traditionally, if not necessarily now, might undertake.
Yeah, no, it's really an emergent strategy. I mean, I remember a piece a few years back by Michael Kaufman about this, where basically Russia can try and fail and try and fail with an operation several times before we get through one decision cycle.
Exactly.
And is that, I mean, I really can't decide if that's our strength or our weakness, because I do, value the interagency process and think it's extremely important and it's essential for good policy. I've never worked in government, unlike the two of you. But I was wondering, do you see our approach as a weakness or a strength?
No, Brian, I think our approach is over the longer term a strength, and maybe even the medium term. But when you're talking about reacting to crises like COVID, I think the Russians are much better equipped to react quickly.
To react quickly in terms of
exploiting opportunities.
Exploiting opportunities.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think they don't need to be as consistent, because first, I mean, the main goal for all of this is control. It's to keep the leadership in power, and therefore it's a weapon that Putin can use. Therefore, he can just push out all these competing narratives as much as he wants, and never needs to sort of be consistent on these things. So it's useful to them, because they don't have to worry about the population and trying to sell their foreign policy, because it's essentially created in the Kremlin for their personal benefit. But you're right, that sort of policy of always having to blame others for things is not one that helps them in the long run build up the things that they need to build up, like the economy and these other issues. So foreign policy wise, in terms of causing damage to us, yeah, they're good at that. They can act quickly. They can keep us sort of off balance. But at some point you wonder, how beneficial really is that to the long-term health of the country?
Yeah, I guess the way you would look at it is in the Soviet period, they were doing this rather effectively to us, but what did it matter at the end of the day? Because the product they were selling was not as good of a product by any stretch of the imagination as the Western product. All right, we are pushing up against the end here. Unless either of you have anything else you want to add, I will wrap it up for this week. That's all we have time for today. I'd like to remind you, you have been listening to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, Director of the Russia Program at Sipher. Joining me has been John Sipher, a 28-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency's National Clandestine Service, and veteran Kremlin watcher and former U.S. State Department official Donald Jensen, a senior fellow at Sipher and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Thanks to both of you gentlemen for an enlightening discussion.
Thank you very much. It was fun.
Thanks.
Depressing, but fun.
And Don thought it was fun too, as he's waving. I'd also like to thank our producer in the virtual control room, Michal Harmata, for keeping the lights on and all the complicated machines well-oiled and sanitized and in working order throughout our socially distanced discussion. I'd also like to remind you could subscribe to the Power Vertical Podcast on iTunes. You could read the Power Vertical blog and watch the Vertical video at sipa.org. And you can follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. Join us again next week. And now, as always, I leave you with the ambient sound mix our producers have created for your enjoyment.